Hey viewers, my name's Cara. I'm your host for Tuesdays here on the Pagan Perspective. This week we are answering a question or speaking about a topic that was suggested by one of our own team members, Eryk, one of our new substitutes from this year. And the topic is spirits/deities. So the text of the suggestion will be in the description of my video as always, but it reads thus. I don't have a succinct question, but I'd love to hear people talk about patrons, holy guardian angels, tutelary spirits, head spirits, and that sort of thing. Do you think they're all the same, or are they different things with different roles? And how many, if any, do you acknowledge and work with? So, this is a list of things. I will go ahead and start by answering one of the later questions and say that I think most of those things are different, and the things that might be similar, I think that the roles are separate, but that certain spirits may play multiple roles in our lives. So let's get into it from there. I had to look up tutelary spirits and head spirits, and I did not find any information about head spirits because those words turn up a lot of things that are totally unrelated, and I wasn't sure exactly how to search to find out what that terminology means in this context. But tutelary spirits does come up with a proper definition that's relevant to this. I'm glad I looked it up because from the word tutelary, I was thinking more like guides or teachers, because it reminds me of the word like tutor, someone who tutors you, who teaches you. And something still, I was like, I should look it up just to make sure. And I'm glad I did, because tutelary spirit actually refers to patrons, guides, guardians, all these different sorts of terms that were listed here within this suggestion. So it's not just a guide, but also could be the patron or protector, and not just of a particular person, but this term also refers to guardian spirits of places, of entire cultures, of institutions, of, different careers and areas of life, things like that. So it could be applied to things like when we talk about spirits of place, or particular deities or spirits, like household deities or household spirits, specific deities that were the protector or are the protector of specific cities or towns. And also, like when we refer to deities as being the god of something or the goddess of something, such as the goddess of arts and crafts or the god of blacksmithing, they would be considered tutelary spirits of that thing. So I'm very glad I looked up the term. Thank you, Eryk, for putting some new terms in here for me. We did talk about spirit communication last month on Pagan Perspective, so I did a short video on that in which I mentioned that spirit communication is not such a big thing in my practice, but I do absolutely believe in spirits. I acknowledge them. They are part of my path, but working with them directly and in any specific ways is not part of my specific practice. So I made a little bit of a distinction there between what is relevant to my path and specifically what I practice. I will link to that video in the end screen of this video, so you can click on that and watch that if you haven't seen it yet. But this is very similar in the sense that many of these things are certainly entities that I acknowledge. So going with the last question here from Eryk, how many, if any, do you acknowledge and work with? I would say all of those things are things that I acknowledge, but whether I work with them is a separate thing. So patrons, as far as like deities, things like that, I don't consider myself to have particular patron or matron deities so much as I have just a handful of deities that I have sought to develop relationships with over the course of my practice. And that isn't even something that I did for a good portion of the beginning of my practice. It was just not working with specific deities or spirits or anything like that. It's not something that I did. So that is only something that I have started in more recent years. And as such, I don't consider it a huge part of my practice or something that I really am suited to speak on in any large way. And spoiler alert, next week we're going to be talking about another topic that is somewhat related to this, so I won't go too much into my relationships with deities this week because you will be hearing a little more next week about that. Usually I don't tell you what's coming up, but it's like very closely related to this, so. But anyway, yeah, so guardian angels are definitely a concept that I acknowledge and I know are a really big deal for certain people. I personally, however, while I acknowledge that they exist and they are things that people believe in, I do not really at all acknowledge them in my practice. So again, it's not like I'm sitting here saying, oh, I don't believe that they exist. Like, the fact that so many people work with them, I acknowledge. I do not work with them, and they're not relevant to my personal practice in any way, guardian angels. I've also talked about, in the past on this channel, we've talked about things like spirit guides and messengers and things like that, and if we think that they are different. So if you've been watching my videos for, years now, and you may have heard me talk about these topics, you will have heard me say that I do think that there's a difference between like spirit guides who often are kind of like there throughout our entire life, or at least are there for a significant portion of our life, who are really there to guide us along some portion of our journey. And then there are what I consider messengers who stick around for a much shorter period of time. Like they show up when we need to hear a certain message or learn a specific lesson, and then they're out, right? And you might see the same messenger a few different times or repeatedly throughout your life, but I consider them different because they're not present all the time. So that's a distinction that I make in the way that I see what I refer to as guides versus messengers. Guides such that hang out for a long period of time and are a part of my path, a part of my practice for an extended period of time, are not really something that exists within my practice. They're not, that's not to say that I don't believe, maybe everyone does have their own guardian spirit as such. I would say that I believe that, sure, but I do not have a conscious or working relationship with mine, if that is the case. And any time in the past that I have felt called to discover that sort of portion of my connections with the spirit realm, thus far has not been successful. However, while I believe that I probably do, in the sense that I believe everyone has that type of guardian spirit available to them, I do not actively acknowledge them or work with them at this time. But I do very much acknowledge and work with messengers when they show up. So that's the way that in my life they've made themselves known, is just as sort of temporary messengers. And I'm cool with that. That's just kind of like how it works for me. So yeah, tutelary spirits, as far as this idea of being protectors or guides of not just specific people, but of larger things, of entire subjects or areas, also definitely something that I acknowledge within my path, and some of which I am incorporating more work with them into my practice today. And I would say that really has only started within the past couple of years as well, working more specifically with acknowledging spirits of place. And so, like, not necessarily worshiping the specific deity of a city, for example. Like, I think that that's something, depending on where you are in the world, those deities or spirits, as the case may be, the patrons of specific areas are more well known in the culture. And that's not really something that we have so much here in the United States. You know, there's no like patron goddess of Cleveland that everyone knows about, right? So spirits of place, what I'm referring to is like, could be household spirits, but also more specifically nature spirits, the spirits who are present in the landscape, who live here, who are the landscape in many ways, right? So we believe that aspects of nature have consciousness, have spirit, have energy. That's what I'm referring to more, and those types of things. And like, because part of my heritage is Italian, the concept of lares as household spirits in Roman culture is something that I have been exploring relationships with more, again, just within like the past couple of years. I wouldn't say that they're something like huge within my practice, but again, these are all things that I acknowledge within my path, that I believe exist, and that I have an interest in, but they are not something that has really grabbed my interest such that it becomes the thing that I am mainly interested in, and then I then put a lot of work into just pursuing those relationships. They're really something that when they show up is when I sort of, you know, acknowledge that they're there, but I'm not like calling them up and inviting them to come over kind of thing. Oh gosh, it's really hard to explain things like this. That was a jumble, I'm sure. Yeah, so I hope that answers the question. I do think that they are different things, but I also think that some of them may share certain roles. So as I mentioned, messengers versus guides are kind of a different role in the way that I think of it. I think that you could have a protective guardian type spirit who does not also actively like work with you or teach you specific lessons, and then you could have your messengers who come to teach you specific lessons or convey a certain message, but they are not necessarily guarding or protecting you in any way. So I think that those roles are separate. However, there could certainly be a particular guardian spirit, or again, whatever terminology is right for your path and practice. There could certainly be one entity who both guards and protects you and actively works with you, teaches you lessons, things like that. So in that regard, the roles are really what is separate for me, and the spirits that fulfill those roles could be separate, or they could be the same, and that depends on the spirit. The other thing I wanted to mention is that the only really like human-esque spirits of any kind that I acknowledge and work with in my practice, or not that I acknowledge and work with, but that I work with in my practice, are ancestors. So I don't think of myself as having like a spirit guide who is a human type spirit. Like, I know some of my friends who have spirit guides, it's like a person, right? And some of my friends, it's not a person, it's a non-human animal spirit. I don't consider myself to have either of those. But when I work with spirits of place, typically they are mostly nature spirits, in the sense of like flora and fauna, and not typically, well, I do also acknowledge the Fae. Yeah, so I guess they're human-esque, you could say. Again, really difficult to describe. But the only specifically like human spirit as such that I work with in my practice is ancestors, basically. And not just genetic ancestors of my personal bloodline, those as well, but also like spiritual ancestors, spiritual lineage, ancestors of the land, and things like that. But typically, most of my focus day to day, especially like this past year, has been on flora type energies and entities, and getting to know my allies in the plant kingdom, essentially. So yeah, great question, Eryk. I did think that it would be good for October because we are entering Samhain season here in the northern hemisphere and Beltane in the southern hemisphere. At these times of year, we consider the veil to be thinner, and that contact with the spirit realm is just that much easier because what is separating us is lessened at this time. So I did think it would be a good thing to talk about, but yeah, always difficult for me to verbalize these types of things, which I'm sure comes as a surprise to some people because I am such a verbal processor, and communication is a big thing for me. I like to have my my terminology and like how I think of things sort of down, you know. The number one thing in my path and practice that over the past 10 years of making videos on the internet about this kind of thing, the top thing that has been the most difficult to explain is my concept of deity, or this kind of thing, talking about spirits and guides and anything within this realm of, I guess we could say, tutelary spirits, kind of covers all of those things. I just find it very difficult to describe, not because I don't know what I'm talking about, but because I think our views are so varied that I think it can be difficult to fully understand what someone else is talking about, because our ideas of these things are so personal, and unless someone else has a very similar or the same experience with something, it can be very difficult to convey. And I think maybe I make it a little more difficult on myself by remembering that knowing as I'm saying things that not everyone is going to know what I'm talking about. So there we go. That's my attempt. So I will see you next time. I hope this has given you something to think about. I hope it's made any sense at all. It really is the most difficult thing for me to talk about. So yeah, let us know your thoughts in the comments. If you have any other ideas, things to share about how these subjects relate to your personal path and or practice, feel free to share. And I will see you here next week. Until then, don't forget to be awesome, blessed be, and thank you so much for watching and or listening. Goodbye.